with one, get a feel for something.
Can you hear me, Anand?
Yes, and a little clearer now. Thanks.
Okay, so I don't know. I assume I didn't bring the phone. I assume Manika will come, but we'll give anyway a couple of more minutes. Where
Sure.
To start. Yeah, absolutely. So what I thought is, yeah, you go in the flow, and then we'll see in what sequence to put into the documents that we'll see as we goes on. But it's good to get the ball rolling, and thanks for taking the initiative, Anand.
Not at all, sir. Thanks for making the time. I know you mentioned this month is a little tight, but I thought once we get things started, it'll be easier.
So let me introduce you. Already know Anupama.
I'm not able to see her, but hi, Anupama.
You are not able to see. Okay. Maybe where is that? Okay. Yeah. I think it's.
Yes, I am able to at least see behind you.
Pranjal, Akshita, and Akshita is third year student. Pranjal is in the second year. Anup is in the first year.
I think.
So we should go. So maybe I don't know if the camera is only on facing, then you guys can sit. Well, actually, you can. I think someone can come here also if you guys want.
Camera is focused on the back.
Okay.
Yeah, well, it's okay. I guess we'll just have to manage with that. Not a problem.
Yeah, that was also, I don't know, did they turn it off for some reason? Where did that person go? Anand, please, brief them how you want to go about in terms of the question and answer, but,
So I am not sure really. I think I'd rather be guided by you than suggest an approach. So this is a project that we have done, and I have content that will cover anywhere between about 20 minutes to 40 minutes, depending on how deep we go into it. I believe that it's probably too much for a case, so we really ought to keep it shorter, and planned it such that we can cut it short and take only one half of it, which is good enough.
Yeah, I mean, how we restructure in the cases, I think let's not worry too much about it. I mean, in a sense that you may want to bring in as much as you want, and later on we can decide whether, to have it a single case, multiple case. That I think we will discuss as we go along. I was more thinking about today's session. Would you like interruptions in between as it
yes,
come,
please.
or you have to? Okay, so
the more the better, because that will shape the discussion a lot more. Otherwise, it just becomes a monologue, and it's pretty.
So that's what I had not briefed them, So Anand and I are, so we are planning to put down some cases. So part of is, of course, to give you the exposure to the projects and the case, etc. But also it is to help us to, the more questions you ask, the better it is, the more enriching it is going to be, looking at different angles. So throw in questions whenever, at whatever level it's at. If we think that it would be better to defer some of the discussions, I think Anand will take that call. Otherwise, we can.
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite unlikely. The trouble though is you may have problems interrupting me. I'll just be going in a flow. Please don't hesitate. I mean, just speak out at any point.
Yeah. Otherwise, you can of course take notes, and later on we'll bring those issues after that session.
I'm also sharing my screen. Just try and get to the right folder.
Actually, my mobile has been put on charge and actually switched off in my office. So I hope Manika is not trying to contact us there. Anyway, but I don't know the number. Do you have a number? Okay, yeah. Or if she is planning to join, I thought she was definitely expected. Unless she is also joining by call her and let's see. Okay, 2 minutes. Okay. She would be, Manake is with joining in a couple of minutes.
No problem. And so in terms of the recording of the session,
Yeah.
that's not an issue, I presume, and we can then upload it on.
Yeah. So there was a technician here, but I think it is being recorded and apparently we'll have the access to it immediately after the talk.
Okay.
So,
Great.
but let's wait for, I think the person who's here. Very good. Yeah, the recording is placed.
Oh, sure. So we'll give it a couple of minutes, and once
Yeah, I think we'll start.
we can start off. And the screen's clearly visible, is it, sir?
The screen is fine. Yeah.
Oh, perfect.
Manaka is here, so we'll get started.
Okay, sure. Hi, Menaka. Let me dive in then. We're good to start, right, sir? The recording is on and we can start.
Yes, yes.
Okay. So this is a piece of work that we had done for a media client, and their point was this. Today, they said we have channels that are providing content based on splitting the country into two geographies. One, there is a Hindi-speaking population. Two, there is the rest of the country. The question is, can we do better than that? That is, can we put together a set of channels and put in content into those channels based on a more narrow segmentation? They said, see, we also know that it's not as if geographic proximity means much. Bilaspur and Hyderabad are actually very similar, even though technically one is in North India and one is in South India. So can we firstly get data across the country on various parameters that may have a bearing to TV viewing? Can we find out which are the relevant attributes that will have an impact on TV viewing behavior? And then group these somehow. Effectively, you implement your algorithms to cluster them somehow. They didn't use the word clustering. Said, I want to know if it's possible to find out which are the areas that are similar to each other. So I will create my content accordingly. So the objective was really segmentation and to also build an interface that will allow people to explore different attributes and cluster based on those attributes. Any questions or comments on the problem?
Can you tell us a little bit history? So, I mean, how? So, what led to this? I mean, who are, what perspective they're looking at it, etc.
Sure. So, this is a client that we've been working with for many years on a variety of problems. And the person who reached out to us was specifically from their marketing team. And the marketing team's objective is broad. It's about finding out what kind of content we need to create, who are the audiences we should be distributing content to. So small little things like, for example, supposing we have to launch a new program in a channel, then what is the kind of serial that we should be launching? Should it be a mother-in-law, daughter-in-law relationship kind of a serial? Should it be an entertainment combined with news kind of a serial? Should it be a reality show? Should it be a music show? Which of these will have a greater impact is the question. Now, within the show itself, what kind of content should we have that will have a greater impact is the second order question. For both of these, an understanding of the audience is required. And obviously, if we have the same content for everybody, the best that we can do is cater to the average of the audience, which is what has been happening so far. So this channel's question was, can we break that compromise? We have the ability to provide different content to different regions. We've just never taken that ability much forward. So can I say that a reality show will really be only interesting for the people in Punjab, and a news come entertainment show is likely to be only interesting to the people in the urban areas, and some other kind of a serial will be interesting only to some other groups of people. Therefore, let us only create these content in these kinds of channels. That was the idea behind it. But the question is, how does one segment? We can't just say, give Gujarat one set of shows and give Punjab another set of shows and so on.
But why did they pick on language per se? Because, I mean, if it is at one particular TV channel, anyway, today's contexts, like they are, all channels are available in all, all localities almost.
Correct. But the viewership is very, very different.
That's true.
So the way at the moment the channels are being treated is, or not even channels, the geographic distribution is being treated is, I will have one distribution policy for all the Hindi speaking areas and another for the rest of the country. So for example, not all regions, from a cable operator perspective, not all regions would have access to South Indian channels. That is number one. Even if they did, their content would have no meaning to that audience and the viewership would be very low. So let us take a Telugu channel. It may have negligible viewership in Orissa, even though they are geographically very proximate. So which means that the content of the Telugu channel is obviously geared towards just the Telugu audiences. However, today, the nature of the content and the nature of the distribution is not even identified at that granular level. Saying, is this a channel which is predominantly being viewed in Hindi speaking regions or non-Hindi speaking regions? If it is being viewed in Hindi speaking regions, then what are the preferences of Hindi speaking regions? And therefore, can we increase that kind of content in these channels versus the non-Hindi speaking channels? That is
so I think, sorry to interrupt. So I think one question is, so is a connection between culture and the language, that is the emphasis? That is one thing that eventually you want to see kind of taste and preferences, how much that is linked to it, and accordingly, maybe the orientations or the programs would change. And it is only Hindi speaking versus rest, or that's flexible, so also like I mean, again, it is, what is the target group? Is it all over India? This was done, and then looking at.
They said we want to go into a fairly deep level of segmentation. So I want to be able to differentiate between the rich areas and the poor areas. I want to be able to differentiate between the Hindu areas and the Muslim areas. I want to be able to differentiate between the areas that have access to, let's say, education nearby, and not with low access to education, highly educated, less educated, any which way. I said, we want to be able to, so they say, today I'm just doing Hindi and non-Hindi. I don't want to be doing that. That is just happening because it is the way it has been done so far. They're saying we want to move away from that. So the question was, you tell me what is appropriate. You guys are the data experts. You take all the data, you analyze it, you tell me what is appropriate. Which our response was, look, we would pick all kinds of variables. You at least will tell us which ones are relevant, right? I said, yes. So you tell us what variables are available. We'll tell you which ones are relevant. And then you tell us based on those relevant variables, how to split the country.
Okay, sorry, continue.
So, which is exactly what we did. Said, let's take all the sources of data that we have, and we decided to go at a district level, because A, that's the level at which the bulk of the data is available, and B, that number of around 640 odd districts was a reasonable number from a granularity perspective. Any more detailed than that, they would not have been able to target it also. So now, where does one get the data from? In this particular case, the bulk of the data was public data. The primary census abstract, the 2011 census, which also covered a household census. The difference between a primary census versus household census is that the former is about individuals, the latter is about households. So, for example, does the household own a car or a TV? Whereas the former is about whether a person is literate or whether a person is working, and so on. The socioeconomic caste census, which has some economic information, some sociological information, some caste-related information. The religious census, which is largely around in each district, what is the proportion of people of Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, Jains, and so on. That apart, there's a website, Districts of India, which has additional data on purchasing power parity, age demographics, and so on. So across all of these, there are about 400 columns. We shared that with them and said, here are 400 columns. You tell me which ones are relevant, which ones are not relevant. So it's quite literally a list that looks like this. Zoom in a bit for you to get a glimpse of some of the items. So how many Buddhist persons are there, males versus females? Jain persons are there, males versus females? Do they have bicycles in the household? Do they have televisions in the household? What is the material of the roof? Plastic or polythene versus handmade tiles versus grass? What is the kind of lighting? How many married couples? And variety of different kinds of information.
So this is a household survey? Sorry, Anand?
It's a mix of all four. This combines the primary census, household census, socioeconomic caste census, and religious census. And some piece of information from the Districts of India website as well. A total of about 390 variables. Sorry, was it a question?
Is it all publicly available data?
The first four are publicly available. Now, I'm learning that there's a huge difference between publicly available and easily available. Let's put it this way, you can get this information. The effort that one has to take in terms of finding it, in terms of cleaning it, and so on, varies enormously. Fortunately, we've been collating this data for years. So this happens to be a bunch of data sets that we have in a cleanly available form. And if one wants to download the bulk of these data sets, today the place to go to is datameet.org, where you'll be able to get the bulk of this data. Having said that, we did purchase some data from Districts of India who had additional data not available in these. We didn't question the reliability or the source of that data. It was only a few variables that we needed. We just bought those.
One more question. Was there some data from the channel side, like the TRP data or of a particular channel?
No.
That would also help in guessing the most appropriate region.
We thought so, and we raised this point with them. The net summary was, they said, let's not worry about what our content is. Let's not worry about what our viewership is. Let's just focus on what people might be looking for. Not even from a content perspective, purely from a behavioral perspective. So this was a call that they took, that we will not be worried about the viewership itself. It's purely demographic based. We said fine. So once we had this and we shared it with them, they said, here are 115 columns that we think may be relevant to TV viewership. You cluster based on this. Now the thing is, once we have these, there is firstly a huge amount of overlap. And there's also a fair bit of correlation. Let's take an example. If I take this plot on the bottom left, which shows the distribution of total workers, which is on the y-axis, to the total population, which is on the x-axis. Obviously, when there are more people, there will be more workers. So the fact that these two are correlated is not a surprise at all, which also means that the spread of the data is very low. This is almost, for all practical purposes, just one variable, not two variables. But on the other hand, if I take the ratio of the two, so on the horizontal axis is the total population on the bottom right. The vertical axis is working population. Now that has a much larger mix. So that ratio gives me a much better, much more useful metric. So what we did was took pairwise correlations and said, if these two variables are practically the same, does it make sense to have both variables? Instead, should we take a ratio? And what are the ratios that are meaningful? Just because two variables are correlated doesn't mean that their ratio has business sense. So based on that iteration, we finally identified 32 derived variables that have a reasonable bearing. For example, how literate is the audience will certainly drive the nature of the content. Whether they own a radio or not is a sign of affluence. And there's an interesting point here, which I'll come back to in a bit. Whether they own the household is again a reflection of the nature of income. Those with, or rather, wealth versus income. Areas with high wealth tend to have high own household percentage. Areas with high income tend to have high purchasing power, and the two are not necessarily the same. We found several areas where the wealth is high but the income is low, and vice versa. I was mentioning that radio ownership is interesting partly because it's actually not a sign of affluence. It's the opposite. It's the poorer areas that have high radio ownership percentage. Curiously enough, mobile penetration is also higher in less well-to-do areas. So technically, it's a little confusing as to how to interpret some of these. But it was evident
What is
that these.
Sorry, Anand, when was this data collected?
This is based on the 2011 census.
2011 census. Okay.
Yes.
And language is not collected.
No, the language was not part of this, and the state itself served as a reasonable proxy for language as a category. Though in this particular case, we chose not to use that. That's a different story.
That's a different thing, but I'm just saying the language information is not available in either case.
That is correct. Yes. So information on the spoken languages is not a feature in any of these four censuses. Though actually, to be fair, I am not entirely sure. Maybe the socioeconomic caste census has a few columns in it, but our subset of features definitely did not feature languages. So once we had this data, so now at this point, the feature selection is done. And the feature selection is done based on two inputs. One, what the data suggests, which is eliminate highly correlated variables. And second, pick the ones that have business relevance. The next step is to apply the clustering. And there's a wide choice of clustering algorithms. So we discussed with our client, talked about how, for example, something like, and okay, this picture bears some explanation. This is straight off of the SciPy visualization of the different clustering algorithms that are available. So what this shows is, and I'll just expand to full screen. What this shows is if you apply different clustering algorithms to points that are distributed in a certain way, what result would it give? Let's take an example. If I take the mean shift algorithm and pass this bunch of concentric circles as input on two variables, X and Y, the mean shift algorithm will come back and say there's only one cluster. and all of it is blue. But if you pass it this distribution where there are like 2 arcs, then it will come back saying there are 2 clusters, one in blue and one in green. And the way it will differentiate them is roughly everything near the top is one cluster, everything near the bottom is another cluster. However, if you apply the spectral clustering algorithm, in the first case, spectral clustering will say there are 2 clusters. One is an outer circle, one is an inner circle. And in the second case, it will say there is a top arc and a bottom arc. And you would argue that in both these cases, spectral clustering has probably gotten it right, because you can see that these are the 2 distinct clusters. However, spectral clustering will also, when you give it 3 blobs, if you see the third chart just below spectral clustering, if you give it 3 distinct blobs, it will say that there are 2 clusters. One is the top one, and these 2 are the same cluster. For whatever reason, it's unable to differentiate between these. Whereas mean shift is actually able to differentiate between these. When you give it a homogeneous mess, mean shift says that's just one blob. But spectral clustering somehow finds order where there is no order and says here are 2 clusters. Now there are trade-offs here. Based on all that we saw, we thought density-based scanning, and more importantly, the modern version of it, which is HTV scan, would be the most appropriate algorithm. Why? Because it allows for different densities in different clusters. I have one loose cloud-like shape and I have one tight packed shape. It is still able to differentiate them. And it won't try and create clusters where there are no real clusters. So we thought that would be the most appropriate algorithm, and all literature seems to support it. When we apply it to the data, what we find is that consistently all of India comprises of one cluster for all practical purposes, with maybe 2 or 3 outliers. Any which way we slice it. Not just for this data set, we find this for the vast majority of the data sets. Why is that? Because we are learning that in business, the real distributions look like the bottom row. It's jumbled up all over the place. There are slight density differences here and there. And we will have to pull out the data from those slight density differences. So we effectively ruled out all those algorithms that had that took the bottom chunk and said this really represents one cluster. So DB scan was out, agglomerative clustering was out, mean shift was out. We could go with affinity propagation, mini batch k-means, and so on. When we applied those, we ran into a second challenge. The amount of time that it took to cluster even 640 was in the order of several tens of seconds for many of these algorithms, given the number of columns. Only one algorithm had a reasonably good speed, which was k-means. And the mini batch k-means is a variation of that, where it only takes a subset of the columns that are most relevant. So it's an even higher performance optimization. We found that k-means was able to do this in real time extremely fast. So there was just no question as to what algorithm we would use by default. But we said, look, let's not stop the user from trying out other algorithms. We put this in as a default. If users want to try other variables, other algorithms, we'll give them an interface. And for the purposes of the results, we will be going in for k-means, partly for its ability to differentiate even weak clustering differences, and partly for its speed. Based on that, we got a result.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
I have a question. K-means required the number of clusters to be specified in before, right?
Yes.
So how do you decide? How do you decide here?
Trial and error. So we said what? So we said, firstly, what is a reasonable number of clusters that you want from a business perspective? We asked, supposing I gave you 100 clusters, would you be able to act on it? They laughed and said, obviously not. And they said, okay, supposing I gave you 2 clusters, would you find that useful? No, 2 is too small. Okay, what feels like a right number to you? I said, see, firstly, this will become an organizational problem. If you say you're going to create, let's say, 10 clusters, then I have to find 10 people who will be responsible for creating this content for 10 clusters. They will basically have 10 times the amount of work as if they had to create data only for 1 cluster. So I cannot afford you to create 10 clusters. even if the algorithm, even if you had an algorithm that automatically came up with a number of clusters, and the answer, the best number of clusters for that was 10, they said, I will still come back to you and say reduce it. But on the other hand, we don't want too few clusters either, because we want a reasonable degree of segmentation. So what is a reasonable degree? Is it not less than 3 for sure, not more than 10 for sure. Within that range, be reasonable about what you want. Let the algorithm suggest what is appropriate, and we'll also see the results, see what is more interpreted. So we looked at different variations. We said, supposing we cluster India into 4, can we meaningfully interpret those 4 clusters? Can we meaningfully interpret those 5 clusters and so on? And I'll come to that part about the interpretation. But finally, when we created those clusters, we, in this particular case, created 6 clusters. We said we are able to interpret these 6 clusters in an intuitive way. So, for example, this brown area, we can classify as a rural, agricultural, poor, young India. It's mostly rural, largely agricultural. The income levels are relatively low and the age is low. Whereas the bulk of Northeast, at least the outer Northeast, can be characterized as the small Christian young. Young is obvious, Christian is obvious, small in the sense that the districts have very low population. Whereas the one...
Anand, can I interrupt?
Yes, please.
Yeah, because you started with Hindi versus other languages, and then it doesn't seem like that is the focus,
That is
which
not.
is fine. Right. So, given Pranjal's question also was relevant. So, what is the purpose? I think you have answered, but I just wanted to reiterate.
Well, the purpose
Would it
was
be meaningful to start with a slightly bigger number of clusters, like if you say is no more than 10 or 12, and then see if we can collapse some of them to have an interpretation which is meaningful based on the constituents of the cluster?
Absolutely. So what we actually did was, let me show you the interface and how we went about doing this. So because it is not possible to try this out every time and interpret it manually, we took this data set and built this small tool where you choose the variables that you want to cluster by and pick an algorithm and cluster it based on that. So let's take an example. If I use HDB scan, which may or may not work, we'll just give it a shot. Okay, let's try something else. Let's try density based scan. Okay, I will try density based scan with, let's say, 5 clusters. Okay, that didn't work. Affinity propagation. Okay, that is trying something. Okay, by default, affinity propagation comes up with 49 clusters. Now, this I know is not actionable. So we have to go back and start changing the parameters. Now, can I use affinity propagation with a reduced number of clusters? Like, let us say 10. I don't know. It may be possible. Let us try. No, okay. Affinity propagation is not an algorithm that allows me to choose the number of clusters. We have to restrict ourselves to something that allows us to choose. Let us say we go for k-means itself. And like I said, let's start with a reasonably large number of clusters. Now, one of the things that we need to look at is whether I can take action on all 10 clusters. Let's look at the size of these clusters. So now I have a cluster number 6, which has exactly 6 districts. If I look at the details of this, let's look at the table of clusters and look at cluster number 6 in this list. Scrolling down to cluster number 6, yeah. So this comprises of Leh and Ladakh, Lahul and Spiti in Himachal Pradesh, 1 more district in Himachal Pradesh, 1 district in Sikkim, 2 districts in Arunachal Pradesh, and 1 district in Jammu and Kashmir. Now, if I take these 6 districts and give it to somebody to say, your content will be primarily targeted at this, the whole purpose is lost. All the guys that will be running this would say, this is too small, this is not really actionable, I need something more substantial. So it also became a trade-off to see what is a reasonable number? So now if instead of 10, I get down to 3. Let's do the clustering again. Yeah. So now I have 253, 292, 95. Now 95 is a perfectly reasonable number to assign somebody. We can work with that, but we are losing too much information. Now, is there a scientific basis to then say this is the right number? What we instead did was went through a few iterations and said, look, are you comfortable with the results that come out when the value is 4? They said, no, not really. It seems. And they also looked at it on the map. They said, no, this is too broad. Now, what about 5? They said, yeah, 5 seems okay. What about 6? 6 seemed okay. 7, no, this has now become too small. So it was a toss-up between 5 and 6. Then we went on to, when it was 5, are we able to interpret the clusters? So what we mean by interpret the clusters, we said, let's go look at the features. Cluster 0, what is the average total population? What is the average people per household? What is the average rural population? What is the average female literacy? All of the parameters that we were looking at. And are there any distinguishing characteristics? So, and here's a slider that allows me to see the most unusual elements. So let's take some of these. What I find is that the rural population is relatively high everywhere, except in cluster 3, where the rural population dips dramatically. The percentage of agri household workers also dips dramatically. So one way of characterizing cluster 3 is that it's the non-rural or urban areas where there are very few agricultural workers. So now if I look at where cluster 3 is, I can see that it's a fair bit of Punjab and many of the metro areas, Bombay, Pune, fair bit of Kerala, Bangalore, Chennai, Coimbatore, Hyderabad. So it's clearly the urban areas, and interestingly, Punjab is coming into the mix. If I look at what characterizes, let's say, cluster 4,
Why
very
Punjab?
low. Punjab is actually very rich. The average wealth in Punjab is shockingly high.
It's but rural percentage is showing less. That's what
Yes. Punjab actually has relatively very few districts that are characterized as rural, despite a high proportion of agricultural land, because the proportion of agricultural workers is relatively low. It's large. There's a large proportion of landowners, and it's again one of those wealth versus income. There's a strong wealth flavor. But what you said is in fact one of the reasons why our client said we would like to break this into 6 rather than 5. Because when we broke it into 6, I'll show it to you on the map. Then Punjab just became a different beast in itself, completely differentiated. The primary difference between 5 and 6 was that Punjab broke off into a separate segment and the metro or the urban regions broke off into a separate segment. And therefore we went with this. Now, but let's ask the question, what is different about Punjab and why does it come up as a separate segment? That was cluster number 5. So if I look at the most differentiated features of cluster 5, that's also shown in text here. One of the most differentiated features is high Sikh population. Nowhere else do we see that kind of population. So the religious mix itself puts it as a different area. The other interesting thing is the low female population. The variation of the gender ratio is relatively low. In Punjab, the percentage of females is unusually low. The proportion of married households is also unusually low. And interestingly, it has relatively high two-wheeler ownership. All of these were very different characteristics compared to, for example, cluster 3. So in cluster 3, we have a low rural population, and that is very differentiated. If you notice, yes, Punjab has low rural population, but nowhere near as low as the urban areas, as you rightly pointed out. And still, it is lower than all of the other areas. A high computer penetration you would see in the urban areas, but that is not seen in Punjab. High degree of higher education, not seen in Punjab. High degree of education, not seen in Punjab. But yet, Punjab is the closest, partly based on income level, asset ownership, and many other characteristics, to the highly urban areas. And yet we wanted to split it up. So it became an iterative discussion. And then came the question, look, is it okay that a cluster has only 20? And our client's response was, see, if it is geographically localized, that makes sense. I have a territory manager who will manage Punjab. Fine. And the rest are clustered in various other ways. That is a reasonable explanation. So we don't mind that one particular cluster has only 20. And this is the nature of the distribution that we went with as part of the first phase. Now, what were the lessons that we learned from this? The first was that there needs to be an understanding of what the features are that go into the cluster. We did not know that. And therefore, the idea was, let's allow the user to choose the various features. They said, okay, now I want to select based on demographics. I want to select based on religious penetration. I don't care about asset ownership and so on. And then see what the results are. We also learned that there's no point asking the users to pick the algorithm. They have absolutely no idea. So on this one, we largely help them with the choices. Lastly, we found that the most important thing is to help them interpret the results. The default output was simply a table that said, this particular district belongs to this cluster. They could not make head or tail out of it. The second output was putting it on a map. Now the map was helpful in that it showed the distribution and they could see some patterns, but it did not answer the deeper question, why is this happening? So the third interface that was built was identify the characteristics of each of these clusters. So we put this table that showed for each of the clusters, what is the average characteristic across every feature, which helped, but was still not enough because they had to manually go through every row and say, oh, okay, sector 4 is unusually low in total population. Cluster 1 is unusually low in people per household, and so is cluster 0. This one is reasonably mixed, and so on. So the next step was to say, I'll help you with a slider that will to pull out the most unusual or most differentiated areas. So if I had to pick just one unusual fact about this distribution of clusters, it is how high a Sikh population cluster 3 alone has, which is evidently Punjab. That is the most unusual characteristic. Second most is the high degree of Christian population in cluster 4, which is probably the Northeastern territories. And the SC/ST mix in these areas is also unusually high, and so on. Finally, we said, rather than people have to go through this to understand it, let's summarize the same thing in words. Cluster 1 has low rural population. Cluster 2 has low electric lighting and high Muslim population. Cluster 3 has high Sikh population. So at the level at which they want to evaluate this, they'll be able to see what these clusters mean. So the entire exercise became, now let me pick a set of variables. Let me pick a number of clusters. And let me understand in simple text what these clusters mean. And then they would discuss, can I use this for my programming? And the answer would be, no, not really. So let's change the variables. Let's change the number of clusters. Let's see if we interpret. The speed of iteration became pretty fast and they were able to settle on something. It wasn't as if they settled on something that was defendable algorithmically. If somebody else came in and said, why not this? It's not as if somebody could say because of this reason. It's more like we have agreed on a certain way of approaching the cluster, which therefore to us meant that it's not as if in an unsupervised problem like this, there is a clear answer. And the value really comes in bringing the clients into the process and helping them discover what are the features that they can make use of and use it based on that. That's pretty much the quick summary of this case.
One question I have. So after completing this project, how did you measure its success, or how did you measure its accuracy? So did you try it out on the real data, which means future data which came to the company?
So the good part about projects like this is it's impossible to measure their success. Okay. So firstly, this is based on unsupervised learning. In other words, there is no such thing as a right thing. the success of this, and to be fair, this is even true of supervised learning scenarios. Let me give you an example. We just concluded a project where the beginning of the project, the client said, we want you to predict which employee is going to leave our organization. Second, they said, we will pay you based on the success of the project. We said, fine, how will you measure the success? Well, if we stop a person from leaving, that generates revenue for us. So we'll give you a share. We said, look, if we tell you that a person is going to leave, what will you do? You will talk to them and make sure that they stay back. Now, you will never know whether the person stayed back because you talked to him. Therefore, our algorithm worked and you were able to stop him. Or because the algorithm was wrong and he was never planning to leave in the first place. So, if you act on the algorithm, it is destroyed. You cannot measure its success. If you don't act on the algorithm, there's no point in you having the algorithm. So, you can't, therefore, measure its success. And that was in a scenario where it was supervised, that there is a specific outcome which theoretically is measurable. But the whole purpose of that exercise was to make sure that that outcome doesn't happen. So that's why we are forecasting it. Same with plant failures. If I forecast that an equipment will fail, what will I do? I will undertake preventive maintenance. The equipment will not fail. Now, has my algorithm worked? Who knows?
And then you could have a holdout sample in a sense that,
True.
part of that.
And the amount of courage that it takes for an organization to put a substantial sample out as holdout, that, if somebody is willing to do that, it would be commendable, because they're effectively saying, in order to pay you, the vendor, I will decide to make a loss of several crores. They usually say, no, it's okay. Just pay you. And also, their object, sometimes it is not even the result of the analysis that drives the success. The fact that somebody has put in effort into an initiative itself is a huge thing. It's like the Hawthorne effect. Sometimes the fact that I decide to do something, it means that it will succeed irrespective of what I do. This is one of those cases where it doesn't matter what the outcome is. Right or wrong doesn't matter. Getting so many senior people in a room to discuss the outcome, that itself has strong value. However, in this particular case, the success is largely determined based on whether they were able to change their strategy in order to move towards a different kind of a content mechanism. That is, can they move from their two-region policy to a multi-region policy? And the short answer is absolutely not. This was nowhere near enough. The magnitude of change that was required was so large that this was step 1 of 10, maybe, to be able to do that, or somewhere in the middle. A step that helped them understand that different regions can be catered to differently. And we have the ability to identify regions in those ways. So while content cannot be distributed this way, what this instead translated to was a sales channel approach. They said, now what we should be able to do is at least delineate our sales teams to not purely focus on regional grouping, but rather based on regions that have similar profiles. So the customer segment also plays a role in our breakup. And finally, they didn't go with this. They went with a far simpler organizational restructuring that brought about some element of customer behavior and some element of geography. It was a mix. So with this project, result in the outcome that was planned? No. Did this project meet its stated objective of being able to divide the country into regions that they would have liked to cater to? From the marketing team's perspective, yes.
Would it be sorry.
So I notice all your variables are percentages.
Yes.
But and you mentioned this radio ownership and mobile ownership.
Yes.
It was surprising that, yeah. I mean, I'm assuming you have them all as percentages because then all your variables are on the same scale, right?
No, not quite. To avoid the correlation between these. So there are at least a couple of variables on the screen, total population and per household, which are a pure ratio. Well, second is a ratio, not a percentage. And the first is not even. The reason why we chose these is to avoid correlation.
Okay. So it doesn't matter if one variable is has a huge range and the others are,
No, to the algorithm, it does. We therefore normalized it. So behind the normalization is happening when passing it to the clustering algorithm. But as far as the user is concerned, they don't need to worry about that normalization.
So another question I had about the radio and mobile ownership is, you could connect it to the, I mean, positively correlate it with the poverty by the cost of the mobile, right? Because we generally notice that, the people in the low income areas, they have a very, not a smartphone or the lowest model, and typically, so that way maybe you could have removed a few more variables from your analysis.
Quite possibly. And it's not as if we're going to pick all of these. We allowed the user the option of picking from any one of these, and they went with a certain subset of this result. But let's take a look at what the correlation itself looks like. So having taken a small percentage of these, now, firstly, you find that internet versus computer penetration is clearly positively correlated. But internet versus mobile penetration, that's negatively correlated. Same largely with computers. This is what I meant by the mobile segment being somewhat different. Let's look at the characteristics of the features that we are applying here. And this particular clustering is based on another algorithm that's probably the subject of a different discussion. This is actually based on a decision tree algorithm. But if I look at the mobile penetration, what we find is that, let me get rid of some of these so it doesn't distract. Yeah, let's take a few of these. Okay, now if I look at mobile penetration, the rich districts are the ones that have the least mobile penetration. The poor are the ones that have the highest mobile penetration. The ones that are breaking out of their poverty, they tend to have high penetration. The ones that are aspiring to become richer tend to have high penetration. Landlords, businessmen, the rich, the lowest penetration of the lot. Why? I think it's the classic leapfrogging effect that these segments are places where mobile is almost essential for doing some of the basic things required for connectivity. But that's really a theory. I don't know. What we do find is that income is negatively correlated with mobile ownership at least at district level. But let's be clear, by mobile, I don't mean a smartphone. I mean any kind of mobile device.
Anand, I have a bunch of questions, but
Please.
One I was mentioning, so would it be, okay, before I get into the case perspective, so something along the line what Anupama was suggesting, variable reduction before clustering. Factor analysis has its own problem here because I think you wanted to retain the original variables for the interpretation purpose. That is very important to have that. But maybe some modification of factor analysis perhaps can be done.
Quite
or
possible.
There was initial reduction of variables. Something was done anyway. Was it an ad hoc? I mean, it was prompted by some qualitative judgments by the client, right? So that variable that you initially from 240 or 400 you had to 115 and then there to 32.
Right.
That state.
Yeah. So actually, this was the phase 1 of the project. There was a phase 2 in which what happened was they said, this itself is too complicated for us to understand. And we are not able to interpret these segments meaningfully. And I'll talk about phase 2 as part of another case, and we ended up using a different approach. But the point was that even things like mobile ownership and so on, they were unable to relate to from an actionability perspective. As a result, what we did was said, we are not going to go further away from these dimensions. we are going to pick subsets of these that are even more meaningful to you. Literacy was something that they could make sense out of. I'll talk about it as part of the next case study. But when we initially applied, not let alone factor analysis, even prior to that, we were looking at derived metrics. They said any derived metric to which I cannot give a stereotype or a business oriented name, let us rule out explicitly. There's no question about it. So PCA, therefore, was not something that we could apply either implicitly or explicitly. Not explicitly in the sense that we cannot tell the user that there is a new variable that is mobile penetration minus education index plus 0.3 into skill index, because they would not get it. We could not use it behind the scenes also because they needed model explainability. And that has become a theme in the bulk of the discussions that we're having, both with the mature client.
Yeah, so I know that, and that's what I have a methodology, which is, I don't know whether it will work here or not, but that is precise. I've not published it. I mean, in that sense, but what it does something similar to the principal component, but it does not essentially create artificial combinations. Rather, it will subset at the different stages. So that I think might work in terms of this. If it is, whether it works or not, that one has to see. But in principle, that could be something which can be used.
Definitely. So that would be very apt here, because all we were doing was knocking off the ones that were clearly correlated with existing variables and then leaving it to the business to pick what they thought was essential. The latter step is certainly something that is required, but the former could definitely be placed on better mathematical footing.
Getting into that, you had a next phase 2. You will talk about that now or later, or
I think that's probably material for another case studies. Like I said, I planned for content. Yeah. That is
so
I was.
That's a different problem. Okay, so I was looking at. So one is the software. So what you are using currently is your company.
Well, just
that thing or.
Python behind the scenes, and we put a web interface on top of it. It's on top of our application platform Gramix that we built this application. But behind the scenes, it's just running Python's SciPy algorithms.
What I'm thinking about classroom usage perspective or case, etc.
Oh, that. You could use this tool, sir. That's absolutely fine. This is very much.
What I was thinking is, well, of course, tool has to be used. Otherwise, much of this is going to be lost. Unless so the way I was seeing this case is, and in answering, I think Akshita's question partly, that this is a primary case for descriptive analytics. The objective, it's not predictive. We're not getting into that part.
Yes.
So we should not look at. It's a rich source of data, and it actually can be a case, kind of an open thing for the students to try on. You can do so much and just do something and interpret and do other variation, selecting some variables or whatever things. There's so many things, and kind of try it out and come up with your own clustering which you like. And that doesn't necessarily have to match with what you are showing in the end, etc. So just
I see merit in 3 elements here. First, as an introduction into unsupervised learning. Second, as a mechanism for delivering variable selection. Is there a robust approach without necessarily there being a right answer? And the third, as you said, about delivering explainable clusters. It's not about whether the cluster is right or wrong, but is the person able to define and explain the cluster in a way that is meaningful from a business perspective? And yes, none of these have a right answer, but there certainly are better and worse approaches.
Data visualization. I mean, I think that's, I think even that, from that perspective, even though in a limited way, but I mean, it does show, I mean, lots of things that, which you would not otherwise, because there are so many variables, so many, etc. So the way you do it, so I think that there is a merit in that.
It is.
Take Maneka's comment, but my perception is, having said all that, I think it is a difficult case to write. Very difficult case. So, in a sense that, I mean, we have to think about what we are saying, that, takeaways from the case, because it is predictive analytics. So, how do we want to go about it? I think we need to think about it. Part of the problem. So, okay, all these computations, that all these different versions of cluster analysis that you mentioned. Actually, I am familiar with all of them. I know only few, but that's part. But these pictures in particular, so they were not referring to this particular data set, or were they?
No. This is just a generic visualization.
Okay.
Scale cluster. I think we should, yeah. If you just search for sklearn cluster, you would find this for, in fact, a few more algorithms perhaps. Oh, no, okay, it's exactly the same picture.
It's the same one.
And you'll find many variations of this explaining how.
So, for example, aggluterative itself would have different variations depending on the. So, but you are normalizing all of these variables by default, right, in the implementation stage?
Yes, we are.
That the first two variables were the population. That played a major role, I presume?
From a clustering perspective, we didn't gauge the relative importance of variables. But if I were to look at the key differentiators, then population has appeared as a key differentiator among the top 10 reasonably often. Usually because the reason here seems to be different. Now, across the different kinds of clusterings, I'm not able to judge how important total population was. But at least in this particular case, I would argue that it's one of the top 10 variables.
Part of the reason was to say is because, those two variables being of different types. We're saying that, for example, like, okay, total population, if it is, like city-centric anyway, perhaps it would be captured elsewhere. Is it possible that it would be captured elsewhere?
True, quite possible.
I don't know.
But what we did was, where relevant, converted it to a logarithmic scale and did a simple range normalization, minimum 0, maximum 1, and within that linear or logarithmic, as the case may be.
Okay, so that, okay.
That way they got standardized.
Oh, so that was anyway, that was also converted in the algorithm stage. Okay, okay. So then it
behind the scenes, they're all combined.
Okay. Thank you.
So I think what you said regarding the case being tough to write, I think that was what I mainly wanted to get to. And to be fair, I agree that this is probably not a good case to write. But I think it's worth trying to attempt what or how we can present it, and I'd love to join in on the process. Partly because a lot of the things that
I think, because if you guys want to leave, you can leave, because I think we'll carry out our discussion for some more time on how to proceed on the case writing for SEP. So, but free to, of course, welcome to stay on. But right, is that okay, Anand?
Yeah,
I think three of us. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Yeah, I mean, how do we take it from here? I mean, your suggestions.
Sorry, Manika, I'm not able to hear your audio.
I think the mic is not on. You have to press.
I said, I don't think we need to get into the process so deeply. We can give one example of one permutation and combination, and one that didn't work so well and one that worked well.
Okay.
I don't know if I'm on the right track. And describe the journey that you went through more than the actual process. Because the process will be left to people to discover which is the best data to present. And they need to go through all of them.
Fair.
Which will be difficult while writing a case. So perhaps if we just write one, they'll get the hang of what to do.
Sure. And
even this is what my thinking is. But you'll have to guide me, Prof.
No, what I don't know. So especially on this, I have no experience also on this kind of. What I was thinking, so I was looking at broadly my understanding of the case would be what the case is about. What is the case objective? So that's what I wanted to kind of set. That should set the tone for how we write, what do we cover, everything. Okay. So what are the key objectives of this particular case? Yes, clustering as an algorithm, yes, of course, but that's methodology perspective. I'm saying that students, what do the students get? I think some fair idea about real life descriptive analytics problem. Again, this is open-ended, but that's okay, I think. Data visualization, how do they do it, etc. But can we, I mean, since we talked about few things, can we find a thread and say, okay, this was the objective. I think you have said it, that was the initial objective. You modified it and we did it, and it may or may not be important from that perspective. So I don't know whether we can pull out something from that. And Manika was mentioning that she has experience of interviewing. So in a sense that if you conduct a formal, so to say, interview with Anand, or I don't know if anybody else in your organization, would that help the structure? Now that you know the context of it more.
So make it like an interactive case.
Make it like a first interactive case, and then see where does it go. Or it could be, I don't know. I am just also thinking it aloud. I don't know. Because to me, I think my understanding is we need kind of starting one page on a description that from the client side that, well, this is how, so we can pose that as a question. What are the things that client said that when they wanted this study to be done at that point, and listing down objectives. Now, how do that transfer to the case itself? I don't know.
Or we can give a description of the entire issue that is on hand and ask him to speak about how he went about doing it. Exactly like what he said right now.
Yeah, so that is already there. So one is, of course, once we have the video.
No, this part can just be the video and a description as a backgrounder. So the student can read that and get a link to this video would probably be able to help with the, taking the case in class.
No. So the video, I don't think there's no point taking that directly to the classroom.
No, we can take it in bits and pieces. We don't need to take the whole lot.
No, the reason being what we are planning anyway, there are several purposes of this exercise, so to say. One was, as I mentioned, so one is to have a full-fledged case, hopefully. And then once we have several of these cases, then we try to put it together for a course. But so the case by itself, so typically what would happen, the deliverable part of it, Anand can repeat the delivery in the classroom directly to the students. So that, there is some merit in using that when Anand is not available, but that's not so much of a real benefit, as far as I see.
Though just thinking about this, one of the things that I'm just thinking about scalability, sir, that if we treat this as a course that potentially goes beyond classroom delivery, not necessarily in its same structure.
And not necessarily an IIMB class. If it goes beyond IIMB and they don't have access to that bit, then they'll be lost with just the description.
No. So see, what happens is in IIMB case, actually they're teaching, it is not actually that much of a challenge in that sense. For example, if a clustering is taught, so this naturally follows up on clustering. So it can, although I said traditionally, when I teach clustering, I don't teach these methods. I mentioned, K-means clustering, agglomerative clustering, etc., etc. But that's, some additional tools and technique. That's not, I think, that big of a challenge. I'm saying, so that can be brought in. But I don't know. In terms of the case that are put up, so like videos and some description like this.
There's a mix. There are some that have a mix like this.
And it would simplify my task in a number of cases where I know that a few clients have specifically said, look, can you explain how this methodology works? For me to be able to pass on some of this to them and say, look, here's a case, read it up from the IIM website would be of great help. Since many of them, I won't be able to spend the time getting on, and getting them into a course for just this one is also not realistic.
Anand was mentioning that says, also his motivation that, he has some form which he can just pass it on. So that, I think, easily achievable. If the video, whatever presentation you have said, that recording is there, so you can pass it on with some write-up. That's not a challenge. I'm not sure that in terms of the cases, because as I said, I'm not.
Or alternatively, we could just give them, the raw data, not all of it. Well, enough for them to work out this situation themselves.
No, that I am assuming that the raw data fully is available and can be shared with the students.
Yes,
right?
That's why I picked this one. It's public data.
Starting point. So anyway, the data and the software, whenever, at least when it's in the classroom perspective. I think in the case, I don't know whether when you write the case, I don't know whether the data is shared or not, that I don't know.
No, it is shared if you need it to be shared, because if the student need to understand what to read in the case and how to answer the questions and analyze the case, you have to give them the data. But instead of it being taught to the students, they can arrive at these conclusions, if there are conclusions, on the case itself by giving them the data.
So I've seen a few cases.
Just say what.
Sorry, go ahead, please.
I'm saying what we can give in the case is the brief that he received from the client.
Yeah, that is a must. I think that I'm assuming that.
That will be the case. The rest they'll have to work out and give us what they come up with.
On which, actually building on that, we could perhaps structure it as a two-part case. Part A is the brief that we receive. For the classroom,
exactly.
That is also the data set that we have. And perhaps bits and pieces of video on the Q&A, as if I'm playing the client role, or the elements that I describe about what the clients told us. Across the video, we can just extract those elements. Let the students solve that problem.
Then finally, one solution that you have, whatever it is, just this is what it is, etc. I think that
this work exactly as an example of a solution. But also from an evaluation perspective, when it comes out, there are a few things that we can also keep in mind from our learnings here. The fact that you cannot take variables as they are highly correlated. You have to decorrelate them. The fact
Yeah.
that
Very good.
you
Yeah.
have to scale these variables and you can't have them in non-comparable forms. The fact that the size of the clusters has to be something that is amenable to business. And fourthly,
Anand, this is very important. I think these things are very important because actually I think the smallest things in terms of the learning perspective, and you see a live demonstration of that. Okay, why variables? I think if we can list some of them, yeah, it will automatically record. So,
and the fourth one, yeah. So the fourth one that I would add is the interpretability of the clusters. These were the big elements of the case, and in fact, we had a follow-on or a phase 2 to this case, largely because while we succeeded on the first 3, we failed to meet the threshold on the 4th. And that changed the entire approach, which we can take up as another case study in itself.
So perhaps I'm not too sure whether the students will have enough time to work on it in class.
That's not an issue because they are not expected. So this is how we generally do. So I'm thinking in the course perspective, actually what will happen is this is long way off from floating at this stage, but my expectation, and actually it fulfills that that part of it quite remarkably well, which is to have so say for example this case, if it is used, it would be 2 or 3 session case where one session, so they will have the readings on the basic context, one session on clustering methods, various methods, the basic idea of clustering, which has nothing to do with the case. But then Anand comes and talks about in details of, implementation of this in this, some specific forms. And then the students actually over the, there is a students as an evaluation component. So they have to pick, say, 2, 3, 4 out of the many that would be thrown. Some could be part of the thing that is discussed. Some could be other assigned ones. But this one is such a rich data set. We can just throw it up to them that they have 3 weeks, whatever, when they can work on the classics. So that's actually is exactly one of the, I was thinking about, if it is a course, then one of the things we have to worry about, how do we evaluate and whether we have rich enough context where we can give the students to experiment. And this serves the purpose for that. So there is no problem on that. There's no expectation that the students is coming to class already having some. That I don't think is realistic expectation. They will have the enough time to do it. That's not a problem.
So from a case and course module structuring perspective, apart from this video, I presume we may need a discussion or two. Shall we plan for that sometime over the course of next week?
Yeah. So what do you want to do? I mean, so on this particular video itself?
No. More, I was thinking more like, so given this, Manika, were you planning to take a stab at converting this into a case?
Yeah, that's what I am talking about. That what do we need to, and I think the key component is that 1 page or whatever introductory description of the problem. Do you have enough on the basis of the video, or would you like to interview him?
I think the much of the case will be based on his brief that the client has given. That will make the content of the course.
But I'm saying that to write that, would you want to conduct an interview of him, or how do you go about doing that?
I think perhaps if I see the PPT that he's already presented, and if he sends me the brief, together I can combine it and write a 1-pager, which you can check to see, whether I've got it right, or, if we can add or minus to that. Perfect. And I'm free whenever you are free. So.
No, remotely it's not a problem. So we can do that quickly, even over a call at any point. So let me do this. I will share the beginning of this session was around a talk through the brief. There were several questions that clarified it, and I will share the presentation right away. And with that, shall we plan? I will leave it to you. But do you think maybe we can chat again on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday? Oh, sorry. Do you think you'd be able to send a document that summarizes the brief by day X, and we can talk on day X itself?
Okay.
My planning was in terms of the overall scheme, and we can see how it goes depending on the success, etc. My understanding is the cases also have a teaching note,
Yes.
right? And I'm presuming that that part I have to write. I am willing to take bulk of the responsibility, although I have to see some of the teaching notes of the other cases, because as I said, the cases I write, I have never sent for publication beyond
No, but
IIM.
would this be going for publication?
I don't know. You have to make an assessment whether it is rich enough for publication or not.
It will be.
Okay, so then we should try to for publication.
Okay.
So
because if it is going for publication, it needs a teaching note.
It needs a teaching note, and I will take a shot at it, and then we can go through the rounds, etc. Whether, but yeah, so sure,
Fine.
I can work on the teaching note. While you are working on this first draft, and then we meet together. Anand, how does it sound?
Absolutely. Sounds good.
Or alternatively, you can take it in class and I can record your class and I'll know how to write the teaching note.
Okay, so that we can do. If it doesn't succeed now, then we'll do that model, because the class is a long shot right now. It's because our plan is that we should have several of these at a reasonable stage where both of us feel comfortable. We have enough material to bring a course, right, Anand?
That's right.
Is that fair?
Yeah.
So only at that point we'll float that thing. So, so I don't mind to wait. So it doesn't have to be the case. Everything has to be each case. There's no real urgency in terms of the case in a publishable form.
Right now.
By this. At the same time, if we can wrap and move on, then it is, we also feel that we are, closing up some chapters and going. So I think that gives us some satisfaction also that, yeah, it's achieving something that spending, etc. is getting. So yeah, we'll take it as we go. So I think what we need is the data and the software part of it. Anand, how do you make that accessible to us?
So I'm mailing the raw data right away, sir. And the software link is on grammar.com. Anyone can access it and do the same thing that I just showed you. It may require some training. Very happy to have, and this session itself would probably have acted as some version of that training. And if you need another round, I'll happily talk through that. No issues at all.
Even if you are busy, if somebody from your company, etc., who is, can get us started, then it might be useful to get, because
no issues at all.
Okay, and the recording of this one should be available for 3 of us right now. That should be okay.
Yes, please.
So we'll mail it to him.
We'll mail it to him. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I could.
Or you were saying that, okay, whatever, Google Drive or whatever, no, I don't know.
Whatever, however it's possible, I'll mail it to him. Okay. I'll just ask the IT people.
Okay.
Because there are various different modes of transferring.
Sounds good.
So I've just sent the data, the presentation, and the link to the tool. Should be in your inboxes any second.
Okay. You mark me on it, or
yes,
I'll get it from Prof?
No. Okay. I mark both of you, please.
Okay.
Post this sometime this week. I'll wait for your inputs whenever you think is convenient, and we can, once you share a brief, we can go through it, or I can even maybe just reply on email with comments or observations if any.
Okay.
Okay. So shall we? I think it is, my suggestion is to have at least this thing at a progressible stage before we do the next one, or it's up to you.
Yes,
at a comfortable level.
I think that will help, sir, because from what we learn from this, we may be able to shape the next.
Exactly. So
more focused in certain way, correct? And
so let's do, let's have a comfort level on the output thing on this one first before we talk about the next one.
Correct. Sure. And therefore, if we need to cut corners in this, that may be apt. Well, the reason what I'm saying is, if going through the entire cycle is useful, but if it lacks the polish for publication, it's in the sense that it's
that's
good
okay. That publication stage, I'm not so worried about. I know that I'm assuming if it is a reasonable quality, that polishing, etc., will
Will be
before we
done.
send
Yeah,
it out.
that has
But we
to be
need to
done.
be comfortable that it is something that,
Exactly.
broadly satisfying that we thought
Correct.
is why we are, that we need to be, each of us need to be comfortable for that.
Unless the second case is also linked to this. If there is a link, then at the end we need to bring in that link.
The second is linked. It is a follow-on, but I think it should be easy enough to bring it in even after we finish this one. That's not a problem.
Okay, sounds good, I think.
So let's take that. So yeah, therefore, where I was going with this is if we accelerate this, cutting corners in terms of polish, grammar, spelling, formatting, and all can come later, and go through the full cycle of whatever iterations, questions, revisions, etc. in a week or two. Then we'll know what changes need to be done for future case studies, and I'll also prepare accordingly.
Exactly. I'm happy with that.
Okay. So in that case, is sometime around, I don't know, Wednesday or Thursday a reasonable time frame? I have no idea what is a reasonable time frame.
What I will do is not give you a definitive time.
Sure.
What I'll do is I'll work on it from tomorrow itself. And the first draft I'll give the prof, and then if he feels comfortable or wants to change accordingly, we can work on that.
What I suggest is you send it to us, both of us, between us, and let's not create another, layer, etc. Just send it across, and if I have comments, etc., we'll discuss openly with each other. So I don't think there's any need to delay on that.
Yeah,
front.
I'm good on that.
Yeah.
So
Anand, that sounds fine.
Perfectly fine.
But I think I should take about 3-4 days. I don't think I should take more.
Sure.
So, but I can't say. Sometimes it might be difficult for me to understand.
And please do feel free to call anytime. You have my number. I'd be very happy.
I will. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Anand.
Transfer this to my pen drive and tell them I could mail it.
I brought also my pen.
No, it'll probably take a long time to transfer it.
Oh, is it?
So probably one pen drive should do. But I've recorded it, so probably might not need the.
Oh, you don't. Okay.
Because I'll be missing out on the visual. For me, it does. Of course, it matters actually.
No, it matters. I think you.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, I can wait till Monday if you give it to me on Monday. That is fine.
Okay, I'll do that. I started out from home at. All that's opened, I think, because of that. Beginning of Bannerghatta Road.
Well, of course, has opened. I thought it had opened.